August 4th, 1941. Before sunrise, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales eased out of Scapa Flow like a shadow slipping through fog. Even the harbor sentries could barely make out who had stepped aboard. Winston Churchill, wrapped in a heavy naval coat, stood at the rail watching the Scottish coastline fade into a gray blur. He knew exactly what this voyage meant. He was crossing the Atlantic to ask for help. Not with those words, never with those words, but the truth sat heavy on him all the same. For 14 months, Britain had fought alone. Night after night, German bombers rumbled over the channel. Week after week, U-boats carved shipping lanes into graveyards. The empire was draining money it no longer possessed, spending US dollars faster than it could secure them, fighting a war it could not possibly win without outside support. And America, with its vast industries and endless manpower, still clung to neutrality. Churchill had written President Franklin Roosevelt 17 times since becoming prime minister, letters crafted to sound friendly, personal, even intimate. Yet beneath every paragraph lurked the same plea. "We are drowning. Please don't let us go under." Roosevelt always replied warmly. He had pushed Lend-Lease through Congress, sending Britain weapons it couldn't afford. He'd ordered U.S. Navy ships to stretch their patrols deeper into the Atlantic, easing the pressure on British convoys. He had done everything a neutral president could possibly justify. Everything, except what Churchill needed most. So Churchill was taking the gamble of his life, crossing the submarine-infested Atlantic to sit down with Roosevelt face to face, hoping that eye contact, shared meals, and honest conversation might move the president further than telegrams ever could. The Prince of Wales plowed through rough seas. Churchill spent the days pacing his deck, muttering arguments under his breath, rehearsing lines as though preparing for the most important performance of his life. A few aides watched him stare endlessly at the horizon, as if he might drag America closer through willpower alone. He had met Roosevelt once, briefly, back in 1918. Churchill barely recalled the encounter. Roosevelt remembered it clearly, and not fondly. Churchill had been brusque, dismissive. That was decades ago, but the memory lingered. Still, after 2 years of letters exchanged in wartime desperation, a strange sort of friendship had begun to form. But friendship wasn't enough. Churchill needed to see Roosevelt's expression, needed to hear exactly what the president would or would not commit to. No one in Britain knew their prime minister had left the country. Not Parliament, not the public, not even the Germans watching the coast. Radio silence turned the battleship into a floating ghost. Every mile was a gamble. If a U-boat sank them, the British government would lose its leader in a single strike, and the coalition holding the war effort together might collapse with him. Roosevelt was taking a risk of his own. He had told Congress he was going on a fishing trip, told reporters he just needed a short rest aboard the presidential yacht. The Secret Service executed an elaborate dance. The president boarded the Potomac on August 3rd, let photographers capture cheerful images of him relaxing on deck, then quietly transferred at night to the heavy cruiser USS Augusta. By the time anyone realized he'd vanished, he would already be in Newfoundland. The American public didn't know their president was about to meet Churchill. Congress didn't know. Anti-war isolationists had no idea. Roosevelt was granting Churchill this meeting, but he had to do it in secret because he couldn't promise the one thing Churchill was crossing the ocean to ask for. August 9th, Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. The Prince of Wales dropped anchor in calm water as the morning mist lifted. Churchill stood on deck, scanning the quiet harbor until he spotted the American cruiser Augusta, her flag hanging limp in the still air. Somewhere on that ship was the man who could save Britain or watch it collapse. Churchill had crossed 3,000 miles of ocean. Now, only a few hundred yards of water remained between them and history. At 11 a.m., a small launch departed from the Augusta. Churchill watched it approach, his pulse hammering harder than it ever had under gunfire in the trenches or during air raids over London. This was different. This was destiny. The launch nudged alongside the battleship. Officers snapped to attention as a figure appeared at the rail, pulling himself upright with strong arms, his legs hidden beneath the familiar braces of a man who had conquered polio. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, smiling broadly and warmly. Churchill felt something twist inside him. Roosevelt had come all this way. He had taken this risk. No letter could express what that meant. Roosevelt was lifted aboard the Prince of Wales, leaning on his son Elliot's arm. Churchill knew about the polio. Everyone did. But seeing the president's disability up close, seeing the effort behind each movement, was different. more human, more honest. Here stood the leader of the United States, unable to walk, yet carrying the hopes of half the world. Churchill stepped forward. They shook hands, two men who had written to each other for years but barely knew each other's faces. Roosevelt didn't start with speeches, no rhetoric, no formalities. He just smiled and said softly, "At last, Winston. At last we've managed to meet." Churchill felt his carefully rehearsed speeches crumble. He had prepared arguments, numbers, charts, every angle from moral duty to geopolitical necessity. But all he could muster in that moment, looking into Roosevelt's warm eyes, was, "Mr. President, it is very good of you to come." They moved below decks to Churchill's cramped, steel-walled cabin. Only 3 men were present: Churchill, Roosevelt, and Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor, the man who had walked London's bombed streets and returned to Washington, whispering, "Britain can survive, but only if we help her." The cabin smelled of salt, oil, and damp metal. Churchill motioned Roosevelt to a chair, and Eliot carefully lowered his father into it before quietly stepping out. And then, finally, they talked. Not strategy, not tanks or destroyers or convoys, not yet. Roosevelt wanted to hear what London felt like under the bombs, what the people were enduring, how the city carried on after nights when entire neighborhoods burned. Churchill found himself describing the wail of the sirens, the thunder of collapsing buildings, the smell of smoke that clung to everything, the quiet, stubborn determination of Londoners walking to work at dawn, stepping through rubble as if it were merely rainwater. He spoke for a long while about the nights he had spent on London rooftops, watching the city burn beneath waves of German bombs, a horrific spectacle that somehow carried a twisted, tragic sort of beauty. He described the sky glowing red as entire streets burned, the white fingers of searchlights clawing upward, the angry arc of tracers streaking through the darkness, the strange, hellish illumination that made the city look like a fiery cathedral built by war itself. Roosevelt didn't interrupt. He didn't smile. He didn't shift in his chair. He simply listened, intently, shoulders leaning forward, eyes locked on Churchill's face, as if trying to pull every detail straight into his own conscience. The president seemed determined not just to hear the facts, but to feel them, the fear, the endurance, the stubborn courage of people who refused to break. Churchill realized that Roosevelt wasn't merely gathering information. He was trying to imagine the weight he would be placing on the American people if he joined this fight. "We can endure the fire," Churchill said at last, voice low. "We can stand against it as long as necessary, but Mr. President, we cannot prevail without you. Britain can survive, yes, but we cannot storm the continent. We cannot crush Hitler. We cannot reclaim Europe without the power of the United States beside us." There it was. The truth, the real plea he had carried across the ocean, the confession wrapped inside months of letters. Roosevelt exhaled slowly. For a few seconds he said nothing. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, almost soundless. At last he replied, "Winston, you understand I cannot simply declare war. My authority doesn't work that way. Congress must act, and Congress will not act, and not yet. Our people still remember the last conflict. They remember the graves. Many believe Europe must solve its own tragedies." Churchill felt a cold tightening in his ribs. He had expected resistance, but hearing the words spoken aloud, calm, apologetic, immovable, hit him like a blow he'd braced for but couldn't entirely soften. But then Roosevelt added quietly but firmly, "However, we can go further." Churchill's breath caught at that single word, "however." "Our naval patrols will broaden, supplies will increase. I'll push Congress farther than they realize they can be pushed, but only to the breaking point, not past it. And Winston," Roosevelt paused, choosing his words with care, "when the moment arrives, when some event makes it impossible for America to stand aside, we will not hesitate. We will enter prepared, not scrambling in panic as we did in 1917. It was not a promise of war, but it was a promise to prepare for war, a signal that Roosevelt believed the day was coming, even if he could not force it to come sooner. Every instinct in Churchill urged him to argue, to plead that every week cost British lives, every month drained their strength, every delay bought Hitler time. But when he looked at Roosevelt, at the sincerity, the empathy, the political constraints that wrapped around him like chains, he swallowed the argument. The president could not give what his nation would not yet permit. Then Churchill nodded and said with quiet acceptance, "We shall use everything you are able to send us, and we shall pray that the moment you speak of arrives swiftly." They talked for nearly 3 hours that afternoon. Roosevelt asked for specifics, endless specifics. How many fighters remained operational? How many trained pilots? What were the tonnage losses in the Atlantic? Could the Soviets withstand the German onslaught that had begun only weeks before? What supplies were most critically needed? Churchill had prepared for this. He had brought the numbers, the maps, the charts, and spread them across the small cabin table. Roosevelt absorbed it all with the sharp analytical mind of a man who understood naval logistics better than most admirals. His questions were precise, tactical, often brilliant. He saw the board with clarity. He understood exactly what America would eventually need to do. When Roosevelt finally returned to the Augusta that evening, the sun was sinking into the water. Churchill watched the American launch glide away, leaving a widening V across the harbor. Harry Hopkins remained on deck beside him. "Well?" Churchill asked. "Will your president bring you in?" Hopkins, pale and gaunt but fierce as ever, replied, "He'll try, Prime Minister. He will push harder than anyone else in Washington. But he needs something to rally the country, some spark, some outrage. Hitler hasn't given him that moment yet." Churchill stared across the bay, thinking how strange, how bitterly ironic it was to hope the enemy would make a catastrophic mistake. Over the next 3 days, the meetings continued. Some were large gatherings with naval staff and military chiefs. Others were small, private conversations in cramped rooms that smelled of ocean salt and steel. They discussed potential operations, contingency plans, communication protocols. Together, British and American officers constructed the early framework of an alliance that didn't yet officially exist. Privately, Churchill always circled back to the same question: when? And Roosevelt always gave the same measured reply: when the American people see no alternative. On August 10th, the joint Sunday service was held aboard Prince of Wales. The sky was bright, the sea calm, when Roosevelt, again carried carefully up the gangway and helped to a chair, took his place among hundreds of sailors. British and American crewmen stood packed tightly on the deck, shoulder to shoulder, forming a single congregation. The chaplain's voice rose into the morning air as the hymns began. Selections Churchill had chosen with deep intention: "Onward, Christian soldiers, Eternal Father strong to save, and O God, our help in ages past." Roosevelt sang with surprising strength, his voice carrying above the waves. Churchill, listening, felt tears slip down his cheeks. This unity, this shared spirit, was what he had come seeking. Not weapons alone, not ships alone, but the joining of two nations that believed in the same moral purpose. When the service ended, Roosevelt leaned closer and said softly, "Winston, that may be one of the most profound moments of my life." Churchill swallowed hard. "It was a symbol, Mr. President, a symbol of what we fight for and of what we shall build together." Roosevelt nodded. Yes, it was." Then with a faint wry smile, he added, "But symbols alone won't sink U-boats. Symbols could stir emotions, but they couldn't halt German armor," Churchill reminded himself. Idealism didn't stop panzers, and hymns didn't sink U-boats. Britain needed more, much more than symbolic unity. Yet from their long conversations came something larger than either man expected: the Atlantic Charter. Across those 3 intense days, Roosevelt and Churchill shaped 8 sweeping principles, a blueprint for the post-war world they hoped to salvage from the ruins. No seizures of territory, self-determination for all peoples, freedom of the seas, the disarmament of aggressor nations, economic cooperation, and a peace built on justice rather than conquest. It was lofty. Some would even call it impossibly idealistic. But Churchill understood precisely what Roosevelt was doing. The president couldn't commit the United States to war, but he could commit it to a peace that assumed Hitler's destruction. And to build that peace, America would eventually have to fight. Clever, Churchill thought as he studied the draft. Politically safe, morally hopeful, but maddeningly indirect. "This is good," Churchill said aloud, as they reviewed the final language. "This is meaningful, Mr. President, but I must be blunt. Britain needs America in the war, not simply prepared for the aftermath. We are holding the line. We are exhausting ourselves to hold it. But we cannot win, not truly win, without the United States." Roosevelt did not flinch. He met Churchill's gaze steadily. "Winston, believe me, I know. But I cannot drag America into war with a signature. I need Congress. I need the voters. And they are not ready, yet. But they are moving. every U-boat attack on our ships moves them. Every German insult moves them. Something will happen, some violent shove from Hitler, and then staying out will no longer be an option. Roosevelt leaned in slightly. And when that day comes, Winston, we will not scramble. We will be ready, because of the work we've done here. It still wasn't enough, but it was all Roosevelt could give. The departure, August 12th. On the 12th, they said their farewells. Roosevelt's launch peeled away from the Prince of Wales, sunlight shimmering on the waves, and Churchill remained at the rail until the small craft vanished into the distance. He had won the Atlantic Charter. He had secured deeper military coordination. He had forged a genuine friendship with the American president. He had gained everything, except the one thing that had brought him across the ocean. Churchill returned to his cabin and dictated a cable to London. I have established very warm and deep personal relations with the president. I believe progress has been made. However, I cannot report that the United States will enter the war immediately. He stared at the typed words afterward. Progress. What a sterile term for what he had hoped would be deliverance. But Roosevelt had said one final thing, something that clung to Churchill's mind like a spark refusing to die. Winston, Hitler will make a mistake. He always does. He'll push too far, provoke too much, and when he does, I'll have what I need. Until then, Roosevelt said, America would prepare, quietly, steadily, for the day when neutrality became impossible. Churchill hoped Roosevelt was right, hoped Hitler would overreach, hoped America's entry would come before Britain bled itself beyond recovery. The crossing back. The seas were rougher on the return voyage. The Prince of Wales heaved and shuddered in heavy North Atlantic swells. Churchill spent long stretches on deck, braced against the wind, replaying everything in his mind. He had met Roosevelt. He had argued Britain's case with every ounce of strength. Roosevelt had listened, truly listened, and had helped as far as political survival allowed. But Britain was still alone. The bombers would still come that night. And the next, and the next. The U-boats would still stalk the convoys. The empire would still bleed men and money. Churchill had crossed the Atlantic hoping for a miracle, and had returned with something far more modest, friendship. Would that be enough? It would have to be. Arrival, August 18th. When the Prince of Wales anchored at Scapa Flow on August 18th, Churchill went ashore to report to Parliament and face the press. He gave them the Atlantic Charter, a grand declaration of shared principles. He gave them the story of the joint service, the hymns, the sense of moral unity. He gave them everything public. What he did not give them were the private truths. He did not tell them how he had pleaded, and Roosevelt had declined. He did not admit he had returned with nearly everything, but not the one thing Britain desperately needed. And he certainly did not share what Roosevelt had shouted across the water as his launch pulled away. Winston, we're going to win this war together. I don't know when, but I know we will. Churchill had lifted his hat from the deck of the Prince of Wales. Roosevelt had raised his hand in response, and for a fleeting instant, Churchill had believed him, not because of promises or strategy, but because of the pronoun Roosevelt chose. We, not you. Together, not after you've survived long enough. 4 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Japanese aircraft screamed down upon Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt called Churchill almost immediately. We're in it together now, the president said. That night, Churchill wrote later, he slept the sleep of the saved, but he never forgot the days at Placentia Bay, when the United States was still neutral. Yet Roosevelt crossed the Atlantic anyway, sang hymns aboard a British battleship, and made promises he could not publish but ultimately kept. Roosevelt had not said, I will take America to war tomorrow. He had not said, I guarantee victory. What he had said was simple, almost casual. At last, we've gotten together. And beneath those plain words lay a deeper message. You are not alone. Even when the map says you are, even when the law says we are neutral, we will find a way, even when the way is not yet visible. Churchill crossed 3,000 miles hoping for a miracle. He received something smaller and perhaps more precious, a promise that when the miracle came, America would be ready. A president quietly preparing for war, even while his nation slept in peace. The one thing Churchill carried home from Newfoundland, the thing he clung to when the nights felt longest, was this: the president understood the stakes and would not allow Britain to collapse. That assurance wasn't enough to win the war outright, but it was enough to keep Britain fighting long enough to eventually win it. And in August 1941, with Britain still standing alone against Hitler's war machine, that fragile assurance meant everything. From those intense 3 days in Placentia Bay came the Atlantic Charter, a document that would grow far beyond the intentions of the moment. Within 5 months, by January 1942, 26 nations would sign on to it, transforming the Charter into the philosophical backbone of what would become the United Nations. The military cooperation the two leaders quietly mapped out on that ship, contingency plans, convoy coordination, shared intelligence, would ignite into full action just 4 months later, when Pearl Harbor dragged America decisively into the global conflict. The friendship Roosevelt and Churchill forged there, aboard a battleship surrounded by cold Atlantic fog, would sustain their alliance through 4 brutal, grinding years of war. But none of that was guaranteed in August 1941. Back then, Churchill had nothing but Roosevelt's word, a promise that the United States would join the fight when the unmistakable moment arrived. All Churchill truly possessed were memories, the sound of 600 sailors singing hymns on the deck of the Prince of Wales, the solemn handshake between two men who carried the weight of the free world, and the president's final wave from the launch, accompanied by the words that echoed in Churchill's heart: "We're going to win this war together." Churchill had crossed the Atlantic hungry for a declaration of war. What he received instead was a declaration of loyalty, of readiness, of eventual partnership. He had pleaded for immediate American entry, and Roosevelt had responded with the only pledge he could safely make: that America would be fully prepared when it finally entered the conflict. Churchill had wanted everything instantly. What he received was everything, eventually. And that had to suffice because Roosevelt had offered as much as he could without losing the political strength he would need to do more later. Some promises, Churchill realized, cannot be spoken aloud, not in speeches or treaties. They exist in private conversations, in shared prayers, in mutual resolve whispered over the roar of the sea. As the Prince of Wales approached Scapa Flow, the Scottish coast emerging slowly through gray mist, Churchill stood alone on deck and replayed Roosevelt's quiet words: "At last, we've gotten together." It was not a formal alliance, not a guarantee of war, not even an official commitment. It was something deeper, an acknowledgement that whether the document said so or not, the two nations were already bound, morally, strategically, and inevitably. It would be 4 months before Pearl Harbor made the alliance official. Yet in a very real sense, the partnership had already begun in those fog-wrapped days at Placentia Bay, when two leaders met in secret and vowed, without needing signatures, that they would not allow tyranny to triumph. What Roosevelt said mattered, of course, but what Roosevelt did meant even more. He crossed an ocean to meet Britain's wartime leader. He risked political backlash to discuss a war his country was not yet fighting. He devoted 3 full days to planning a global struggle he legally could not enter. He prayed alongside British sailors, sang hymns beneath a foreign flag, drafted a vision for the world after victory, and then looked Churchill straight in the eye and said a single defining word: together. And when Churchill later needed hope, when he needed to convince himself that Britain could endure, that help would come, that the darkness would eventually break, he returned in his mind to those 3 days in Newfoundland. He remembered Roosevelt's handshake, Roosevelt's warmth, Roosevelt's final call across the water: "At last we've gotten together." They had gotten together, and from that moment onward, the world could never return to what it had been.